After the death of Passacalia, his brother, Anaxandron, would rule over Karakis, then Passacalia's heirs, and so on. The Anorum Passacalia, started by the first monarch of Karakis, would continue on for the next few millennia. Much like Cradle after the end of Little War, Karakis would soon rebuild and in enough time, return back to its full glory and beyond. With thousands of years to itself, even infinite monkeys with infinite typewriters would eventually build a rocket to space. The empire would slowly spread itself throughout nearby stars, colonizing distant planets and moons such as Arudine, Ispasalar, Tilimsan, Iolete, Kairadin, Bumara, Begum, and Bo. It was, at that point of history, the biggest human civilization of all time. However, it will soon collapse under its own weight. As great as Anorum Passacalia was, its grandness cannot overcome the slow speed of light. Administering a world with hundreds of millions of subjects was already difficult, but it cannot be even compared to the administration of an entire interplanetary empire. Communication between worlds would take years or decades, and so did the travel between worlds. Corruption grew fat on the colonies, as no one will find out about the missing shipments or taxes until it has been years, decades, or even centuries. For millennia, the tension boiled as people yet again pretending everything was fine until it wasn't. Kairadin was rebelling. Tired of paying tithe to a throne that wouldn't care about them, Kairadin declared itself a free republic. In response, the Anno sent out one of their most loyal generals, Tyrannous of Delamar, with a massive fleet of warships and soldiers to suppress the rebellion. However, the journey took a decade in real time, about one subjective year for the crew, and Kairadin has transformed from a colony to a fortress. The battle that followed was a bloodbath, but it didn't change the outcome of the war, merely delaying it. However, Tyrann's fleet soon received a communication packet from the Emperor, or rather, Emperor Apparent, who is in transit to Karakis from a colony world, to halt any engagement. And then a series of contradictory transmissions came, all declaring them to be the heir to the throne and all others to be false, but one thing was very much clear, the Emperor was dead. And the Anno was unprepared to handle competing legitimate claims within the limit of sublight relativistic travel. Other colonies of the Anno soon declared themselves independent and a series of succession wars were being fought throughout the Anno. Unsure of how to proceed, Tyrann's force brokered a peace agreement with Kairati, granting them independence, while his fleet will return back to Karakis to enforce peace until a true heir has been found. When they returned after another decade in real time, the situation was grim. Karakis was burning. Its surface was crisscrossed with muddy battlescapes, long network of trench lined with millions of conscripts, peasant levies, and mercenaries. The grand forest has been burned away, the throne Karaka and many cities were in ruin, the emperor was gone and so were the many heirs that claimed their birthrights and raised armies from Karakis' population. As soon as his fleet reached the orbit of Karakis, various factions on Karakis demanded his fleet to surrender his weapons and began to target him. Exhausted, with his emperor dead with no clear heir, with his home city in rubble while the world was covered in stagnant trench warfare, Tyrannus made his move. Immortalized at the base of his monument on Karakis, was his response to all incoming hails, "I serve the people of Karakis, and its throne." Tyrannus ordered his battleships to open fire upon the encroaching fleet, then, he ordered his battleships to open fire on Karakis itself, targeting all last known sites of all heirs, military production plants, and garrisons of significant size. Even with his fleet being 2 decades old, it was still the largest fleet of military ships ever put into space. After the bombardment, the invasion began. Tyrann's army began to fight in the massive halls of Throne Karaka, against the Imperial Guard that refused to surrender. On the 7th day of the invasion, the throne was breached and Tyrannus moved in with the first wave. The last of the Imperial Guard died where they stood, and they found the remains of the Emperor, still sitting on his throne. With his army victorious, Tyrannus climbed the steps, and after removing its crown, threw down the desiccated corpse and declared himself Tyrannous. And thus, Anorum Passacalia has ended, and Anorum Tyrannous has began. The Anorum Tyrannous started with as much violence and conflict as it ended the previous one. There were still successor claimants and imperial loyalists throughout Karakis, which took decades to root out. All artifacts of Anorum Passacalia were destroyed, to completely and thoroughly send a message that, Anorum Passacalia has ended. According to history, even with such brutality, the people of Karakis celebrated his ascension to the throne and the announcement of a new Anorum. The previous Anorum has caused a series of spats that ended tens of millions of lives, and Tyrannous has the will to end it. But, as I have mentioned, this was according to history, and history was written by man. With Karakis fully in his control, Tyrannous turned his eyes towards the rebelled colonies. The colonial unification fleet will soon be launched, but without him. Instead, it was his son, Tyrannous, that will be leading the fleet, while he and his daughter, Calendula, will remain on Karakis with her as his heir. Anorum Tyrannous was still young, at just over 2 decades, his presence was still required to maintain morale and cohesion on Karakis. While the massive fleet was armed to the teeth, the unification campaign wasn't solely martial. Ahead of the fleet was emissaries in fast light ships, equipped with messages of peace, gold tributes salvaged from Throne Karak, and other displays of wealth and power. Some worlds pledged themselves to the Anorum after being convinced, like Ispasalar, Tilimsan, and Bo. But some didn't, like Tyrannous' old rival, Kairadin. It ultimately didn't change the outcome under Tajit's fleet and army, merely delaying it. By the end of the decades-long campaign, Tyrannous was on his deathbed. Calendula had already taken his place as the ruler of the Anorum, but a formal ceremony for the transition of power was necessary. However, Tyrannous wanted to hold it off until Tajit's return to show to his subjects that there won't be any conflict over the succession. But, there's a problem, it would take Tajit's more than a century to return. By the time he's back, Calendula's children would be of age and likely to sit on the throne, and this could potentially spark another succession war. To prevent this scenario, Calendula called a light-linked dialogue with Tyrannous and Tajit's, to determine the right course of action. After discussing with their advisors, they came to a previously unthinkable conclusion: the Anorum Tyrannous must end. And it did. Peacefully. The Dynasticlade, an orderly transition of power from an imperial monarchy to a new federation of noble states, was established. Tyrannous would rule out the rest of his natural life, Calendula would ascend the throne and name no heir, aiding in the transition, and Tajit's, upon his return, would make no attempt to rule, and would instead manage the affairs of the royal family, continuing the Anorum in a ceremonial manner. The new federation was essentially a council of rulers chosen from the nobility by the nobility. No longer will Karakis and Karakis only be presented with utmost importance, together, each world would be represented and decide the fate of all people. An electoral class free of the ties of previous nobility and ranking was formed, and new houses were soon established in the nameless category, to be determined by the world in which they established upon. In modern times, these nameless houses are known to most as the major houses, with their name remained unchanged, like the House of Order, House of Remembrance, House of Glass, and so on. Unlike the current houses, these houses were more like party organizations, to collect the voices of the people of one world together. The Dynasticlade progressed without much of a trouble, much to the surprise of just about anyone considering how bloody the conflict the Anorum had was. Soon, the new federation was formed, and peace was at hand. Hello there, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell button. If you really want to support my channel, you could visit my Patreon page, or buy me some coffee, links in the description. Anyway, have a nice day.